To those of you who are online, look, I don't blame you. That's fair. So, a little bit of housekeeping. If there's a fire, this neck sits over there and over there. If there's an earthquake, you know the drill, drop, cover, hold. And then, I don't know, I'll say whether we should go or not after that, after the taking stops. If there's a tsunami, we're told to run from Mount Victoria. Good luck, everyone. And the toilets, most importantly, are down the stairs and to the left and then round and down. So, that also leads me to a huge thank you to tonight's venue. We're here tonight at the Whareawaka, and just want to acknowledge that, you know, this is a really significant space for our local mana whenua, and it's a privilege to be here and to be hosted by them. A thank you also to Asa Abloy, who is enabling all of you online to be dry, and a thank you to our speaker, who, well, the simple introduction is that Christopher Kelly is a Wellington architect and founder of award-winning firm Architecture Workshop. But Chris is no simple architect. He has provided me a very extensive list of awards and significant recognitions over the course of his career. There's a Prime Minister's Award, a Worldwide Emerging Architects Awards, various project awards, invitations to conferences and award juries, and he's led significant projects across the Motu. Waitomo Caves, Peregrine Winery. It's a really impressive array and very hard to condense down. Chris has certainly not been idle in the last 35 years of his career. And so when he proposed to talk about housing supply and demand issues, I knew he was serious. Tonight he's promised to examine if housing is a public good in Aotearoa, and he'll recommend some solutions. So, I think we're all well versed at this stage with the housing crisis, the nuances, the complexities. So, I mean, your presence here, I think, shows our eagerness to get our teeth into this. So please join me in welcoming Chris.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Tina. I just want to dampen down the speculation that we've got all the answers for the housing crisis tonight. We're going to discuss them. Just got them all sussed. There's 10 of them there. Okay, let's get underway. I'd rather it was it's wide-ranging. It's be a discussion. I don't mind if you interject. And there's a lot of intertwined moving parts in the housing crisis. It's part of the economy, as you will all know. So just start talking about our beautiful country. Our striking landscape form is due to the continual uplift and tilt and the high rainfall erosion of the earth, of which we're having a fair bit tonight. Cape Tuakai has moved 3.5 metres vertically, 8 metres north and 5 metres west over the last 500 years. This land air, or Te Rua, a Maori continent between Australia and Antarctica, was part of Gondwana land and drifted apart 100 million years in the late Cretaceous period. Recent bore drilling at sea on the ship George Resolution has provided evidence that New Zealand is the visible part of the world's 8th largest continent, the size of India. 95% of the continent is submerged 1 to 2 kilometres below the ocean. Abel Tasman sailed over it in 1642 and was so disappointed to find that Murderer's Bay was not really the great southern land that balanced up the globe, that he went home and never returned. Areas of fissure where the pressure of the meeting of the Pacific and Australia plates has created enormous stress, folding and ripping the surface, and has stretched the thicker continental crust like pizza dough, and probably accounts for its sinking. A subduction collision zone fault runs through New Zealand where these two crusts collide, the ocean floor crust pushing under the lighter continental crust. One of the few Maori legends that most Pākehā know is that Maui and his brothers fished up the North Island to Ikia Maui. Wellington Harbour is the fish's mouth. Celebrated architect Riri Thompson's Maui fishing line, City to Sea Bridge, in Wellington commemorates this knowledge, which once demolished, I imagine, we'll have to make sure we link to it in another way. Geologically, this is absolutely correct. The North Island is relatively recent. Maori has observed that Aotearoa is different from all the other islands in the Pacific. Maori knew New Zealand from close observation of the rock types that Aotearoa was different. The recent 2017 nautical bores, positions shown by the red stars, provide new evidence identifying the crust geomorphologies and that align with the legend. How did they know? 6 days in Nelson and Canterbury. The mobile plastic land has informed Pākehā culture too. Displaced settlers intent on recreating the homeland began searching for local identity. Everyone wanted to be distinctly New Zealand, and still wants to be actually, distinctly New Zealand without being parochial. New Zealand painter Colin McCann, 1919 to 1987, set out to uncover the structure of the land. He consulted Wellington's own Sir Charles Cottons, renowned geology professor at VUW, and his seminal book, Geomorphology of New Zealand. Justin Patton, art critic, writes about McCann's work as boxed horizons. The landscape is dominant, empty. A 6-day bike ride from Canterbury to Nelson to go fruit picking, a meditative journey, lives unfold. What is lost and gained on the way, in reference perhaps to McCann's new marriage, 6 days of biblical creation, some blood is spilt. Takes 100 years to build 1 centimetre of good soil. Settler cultures exploit the natural environment to maximise production. Whenua nurtures us if we keep the whole ecology in balance. 1.1 metre deep agricultural back loess alongside, this is the picture, alongside non-permeable urban ground with asphalt on top. The soil is dyed, water becomes polluted and runs off, flooding increases. This is one of our posts in our hashtag Architecture New Zealand Oviana series. In the EU land take, in the EU, land take and soil sealing steadily covers about 800 square metres per year, half the area of Auckland. There's no current legislation in Europe to contain this. New Zealand should consider protecting and repairing whenua and to put reasonable limits to contain or resist urban sprawl. New Zealand already has extensive sprawl. Let's consider some stats. Thrilled to now be the biggest Australian city, Melbourne covers 9,900 square kilometres with a population density of only 500 people per kilometre squared. So you have to account for that, Kirsten. It's not really a design city. Auckland sprawls over an area of 1,000 kilometres as it continues to seal over rich market garden soil for its density of 1,580 people population per square kilometre. Although Tamaki Makaurau hasn't learnt anything from Los Angeles, an area there of 1,299 square kilometres has a population of around 3,000 people per square kilometre. Benchmarking with a similar sized city, Vienna covers 414 square kilometres with a population and density of 4,600. It's 3 times the density of Auckland. The quality of our dirt is the basis of all biodiversity. Hence, we must expand our cities inward. 70%, and that's a good catch cry if someone starts talking about planning, 70% of any city is residential, so to expand inward well, the municipality must encourage a diversity of low-profit co-housing complexes that enhance neighbourhood cultural activities. Bold exemplars like Zar Fabric in previous posts achieved densities of 180 dwellings hectare, on floor area ratios of 2.2. Endlessly expanding the periphery is the low-hanging fruit option. The reason why Wellington is compact, walkable city is a quirk of fate, moving the settlement from the Petone foreshore. Research at Monash Uni shows mental health declines in isolated suburbia as it increases towards the periphery of the city. The other downside in our speculation culture, apart from who shoulders the cost building the infrastructure, is that first-home buyers stretch themselves to get in on the property ladder and then find they are trapped. No one wants to buy into an area that doesn't have an established community. Aotearoa should legislate kaitiakitanga, a food belt ecology around cities. Flooding the market with houses we will come back to. Culturally in both New Zealand and Australia, the 19th century land boom after the gold rush reinforced the idea that land speculation is the basis for wealth creation, the last frontier. In 1887, Australia daily paper The Argus, which went on to become The Australian, wrote, "Earth hunger has always distinguished the Anglo-Saxon race, and a piece of land, if judiciously bought, is acknowledged to be one of the safest investments." In 1776, Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher and father of classical economics, wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. It became widely accepted that, in serving his own interest, the individual serves the public interest. He is guided to do so as if by an unseen hand. There were no women then. Better the unseen hand than the visible, inept and predacious hand of the state. The great scholars of classical capitalism only concerned themselves with progress in the advanced European countries. Unconstrained capitalism in the colonies was something to be urged and was viewed as a progressive force. The idea that land was plentiful and easily obtained was established in the first few decades of the colony, and the dream that everyone, except the original inhabitants of course, could acquire a quarter of an acre on which to build their castle. Alan Kohler, an Australian economist, succinctly sums up. So the treatment of land in New Zealand and Australia's first century created conditions and attitudes that led to the housing crisis of the third century. This is a quick little image that compares the recent prices between 2015. Is it flicking on that screen too? It's just flicking on my screen. I'll keep me on my toes. 2015 to 2019, so left to right, land site prices, property prices and construction costs. When public authorities invest in infrastructure and improvement of neighbourhoods, the resulting uplift in land values and house prices, rents is captured by all landowners and developers. The cavalier and jaded New World response to simply increase land supply around city edges will not apply downward pressure to house costs. Given the decoupling of house prices and rents from incomes, land is the problem, not the solution. The law of supply and demand combines two fundamental economic principles, describing how changes in supply and or demand of a resource, commodity or product affect its price. If supply rises while demand stays constant or declines, the price will fall. Conversely, if supply constricts while demand stays constant or grows, the price will rise. Investopedia's definition. However, demand for basic necessities like housing is relatively inelastic, meaning it is less responsive to changes in price. As the price of housing rises, consumers cannot easily shift to substitutes. Inelastic means there are not many available alternatives. Consumers must also have the ability to pay for the shelter they want. Because the demand for housing cannot be controlled by price, then it follows that relying on the free market mechanism to deliver housing is a fallacy. High prices do not reduce demand, therefore the Adam Smith invisible hand driving the market cannot meet the demand for shelter without the intervention of the, as he termed it, the predacious state. New Zealand recognised this in 1930 under the first Labour government by building 12 Fife Lane in Miramar, the first state house. Completed in 1937, 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house was built with plastered brick walls, concrete tile gable roof, and sited on a 500 square metre section. That's quite significant because that was about half the ideal Pavlova paradise, quarter acre section. Australia recognised the limits of the market after World War II by creating the 1945 Commonwealth State Housing Agreement to provide federal funds to the states to ensure that all citizens had affordable access to a house. We consider that a dwelling of good standard and equipment is not only the need, but the right of every citizen, whether the dwelling is to be rented or purchased. No tenant or purchaser should be exploited by excessive profits. The CSHA agreement was ended in 2003, about the start of neoliberalism taking effect in Australia. In 1985, Aotearoa's new Labour Finance Minister, Roger Douglas, embraced the principles of small government, balanced budgets and free market neoliberal policies. These were a sharp departure from the post-war political consensus of interventionism, protectionism and full employment. The concept of civilization is often associated with various tangible artefacts and advancements, such as tools, architectural systems or governance. Michael King used the analogy of the coral reef, but I have heard civilization simply described as life passed down from one generation to the next. However, anthropologist Margaret Mead presented a different perspective when she was asked about the first sign of civilization in a culture. Rather than focusing on material objects, she emphasised the significance of a healed femur bone. In Mead's view, the animal kingdom provides a stark contrast to human civilization. When an animal breaks its leg, survival becomes nearly impossible. The inability to escape from danger, access water, or procure food renders the injured animal vulnerable to predators. Consequently, no animal lives long enough for a broken leg to heal naturally. Mead's explanation lies in the collective care and empathy demonstrated by a community, and that's why she considers a healed femur bone is considered the first sign of civilization. When someone breaks their leg, the femur bone is the longest bone in the body. It's a moment of trauma, extreme vulnerability and danger. However, if the injured individual receives aid and support from others, they can overcome this critical period. Mead suggests the healing process involves multiple steps. First, someone must have witnessed the accident and recognised the injured person's distress. Then they would have provided immediate assistance, possibly by binding the wound and ensuring the person's safety. Finally, they would have stayed by their side, offering ongoing care and support during the recovery period. By highlighting the significance of collective care, Mead emphasised that civilization begins with recognition of the suffering of others and the willingness to help. It's through acts of compassion and support in the community that establishes its foundation of empathy, cooperation and social cohesion. I thought this was perfect, this little artist. I've mentioned most of this. At the same height, they chose the height of 6.6, so everyone was a giant, and you could choose your shoes from a counter down the road. So in a way, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give everyone the right size shoe so that they can look everyone else in the eye. There are two political tribes in New Zealand, moderated by MMP, well until recently, and in Australia's case, moderated by the Senate or Upper House. When it comes to thinking about solutions to unaffordable housing, one tribe says the problem is tax breaks that boost demand too much, Labor generally says that, and the other says it's zoning and planning that restricts supply. National always says that. Despite a succession of inquiries and reports about housing affordability, nothing has ever worked for long enough because it hasn't been supported by national consensus. These two tribes can't be reconciled, writes Alan Collar in his quarterly essay issue. This is a foundation of these 10 points was Alan Collar's book. The Great Divide, Australia's Housing Mess and How to Fix It. New Zealand's 5.2 million people live in 2 million dwellings, of which 65% are privately owned. The lowest ratio since 1951, 35% are rented. Census data shows that home ownership peaked in the 1990s at 74%. Two-thirds of the population is therefore in favour of restricting the supply of housing to maintain the value of their own, and they're supporting that by banks, developers and capitalism. What are we trying to achieve, and does anyone in power really want to achieve it? Though I was encouraged by Chris Bishop's recently recognising that bipartisan agreements are important. New South Wales set a good example. Both governments backed the ongoing funding of the new metro, and both turning up to celebrate a world-class piece of public transport infrastructure. So if the Aussies can do it, we can do it. Just wanted to restate the problem. This is Ireland's problem. It's a little bit different from our problem, but not much. The 2022 census recorded well over 100,000 vacant and derelict properties across Ireland. Long abandoned rural cottages, empty apartments in city centre, ghost estates, housing developments that were being built at the time of the financial crash in 2008 and were never completed. At the same time, Ireland has a housing crisis that is severe, persistent and deep-rooted. The average rent in Cork increased more than 10% in 2023. Dublin, the capital, has become one of Europe's most expensive cities to rent housing in. Two-thirds of the country, 18 to 34-year-olds, are living with their parents. This year, homelessness has reached record levels. Ireland's economy and home prices have rebounded, but home ownership has not. By January 2023, the average home price in Dublin was 9 times the average wage, very similar to New Zealand's. Building has not kept up with demand, and tens of thousands of people on waiting lists for social housing. For people looking for homes to live in right now, near family or work, the situation has started to feel like an emergency. Ireland's two main parties, in a coalition with the Green Party, that would be a good idea, insist that they support home ownership. When Simon Harris took over as Premier, in April, he promised to fix the housing crisis once and for all and build 250,000 homes in 5 years. I haven't heard any numbers from our government of any targets, are there? Maybe I haven't got all the news. But we're going to flood the market. The government has also taken steps to reduce the number of empty buildings, offering grants for renovations and creating a tax on vacant properties to discourage developers from hoarding. But the level of the need has created a space that both the left and the far right are seeking to fill. Ireland is hardly an outlier. Dissatisfaction with housing costs is high across rich countries and a driver of the far right in Europe. The Irish government must call an election by March 2025. There could be a snap election as early as November. Who will win the argument over what is at the root of this crisis and how to solve it? If the anti-immigrant messaging of the far right can succeed in Ireland, a country that deeply understands what it means to leave home in search of a better life, what does it mean for elsewhere? So you see, we definitely won't be solving all of this tonight. Our country is founded on a culture that set out to be egalitarian and assumes a compact with future generations, that we leave the place in a better shape for them. Ka te aikitanga. Aotearoa is at risk of breaking under the weight of housing affordability, exacerbating and growing generational inequity. Here too, housing prices that were 3 to 4 times income have become 8 to 9. The average New Zealand wage growth of 2.1%. House prices would have to stay where they are for 28 years to allow incomes to catch up. Australia, with a higher average wage growth of 4%, contributed to by stronger union lobbying, would only have to ensure that house prices stay where they are now for 18 years. I don't think that's the answer. So this is the one that's becoming top of the hit parade. Immediately rectify the tax system distorting demand by limiting negative gearing to newly built houses, and use a simple formula to adjust the capital gain for inflation before taxing it at the marginal income tax rate. Currently, the rate is 10.5%. In Australia, the marginal rate is 16%. This is nothing new. This is how capital gains tax operated in Australia for the 14 years between 1985 and 1999. In the 2019 Australian election, Bill Shorten's Labor solution to tax capital gains only for new housing at a reasonable 20% did not find favour with the voters. Somehow Kiwis also passively accept that the taxpayer, i.e. the public account, should forego significant income from taxing capital, even at a discounted rate. You know, we're not even charging 30%. It's just at the basic rate of 10.5. Since 1996, the public purse has foregone around 150 billion of real income the state would have earned if it had not privileged property owners over renters. This would go a fair way to filling the current $100 billion infrastructure hole we currently have. Do we give money to individuals who already are usually well off, or do we build a more caring society? It's above my pay grade. But perhaps it's starting to change from both Jacinda and Chippy chickening out before the last election and Shorten's gutsy and correct proposal. Q&A the other night in Australia on ABC TV, the program on intergenerational wealth, announced a poll sample of which only of 1,500 people, but it resulted that 6 out of 10 Aussies think there should be a change to the negative gearing rule. There should be a limit of 3 houses to private investors, and they should keep building social housing. Under age 50, this rose to 70%. So people are accepting that their property values continually increasing is harmful intergenerationally. When this tax was first introduced, Alan Collar explained, when the negative gearing tax was first introduced, he explained it hugely reset the perception of housing as a human right to a market. It changed the way people thought about housing, and they started speculating and investing more. Though they didn't vote for Shorten, who proposed exactly this in 2019. Morrison fanned the false culture war binaries honed from their focus groups. You can see it happening here. Given the tradie Australian simplistic talking points, property owner equals lifter equals hardworking, renter equals a leaner equals a bludger. There also needs to be a clear assessment of the national need for longer-term population growth. Immigration policy should not simply be driven by business demand for low-cost labour. Link immigration to the capacity of the New Zealand construction industry. i.e. net overseas immigration would be kept at roughly 2 to 2.5 times the number of housing approvals. Current housing approvals year ended July 24. Number of new dwellings consented was 34,000, down 22%. On the above ratio, that means we could manage about 60 to 80 new immigrants. The current net immigration in 2024 is minus 80,000, so a net loss. So wildly out of kilter, unbalancing the interlinked supply systems and losing skilled builders and tradespeople fast, as well as not attracting capital. We'll talk a bit more about that later, about infrastructure competition for labour. Flooding the market with houses is traditionally Tory rhetoric. Let the city sprawl, encourage the private market to supply new houses. Hobsonville was a supply-sided solution. HLC, Hobsonville Land Company, originated by the National and then morphed into Homes, Land and Community under Labour, delivered about 2,000 dwellings. Civil Master Planner A.V. Jennings, the developer, provided pipes, roads and trees and divided the land up to bid for 5 or 6 large volume housing suppliers to buy the land and they set out their expecting housing mix. That's how Hobsonville worked. It's quite a successful suburb, delivering about 50 dwellings a hectare, about the same as Freeman's Bay and Mount Vic. So we weren't that ambitious. We've got better. And Edward, this is a supply-side solution. Argue for continual refinement of legislation. More and more utilising data that explores digital twin planning options, contain unsustainable sprawl, target middle ring developments. 70% of cities are residential. Recent census statistics from Melbourne show that between 2001 and 2023, dwelling supply increased by 30%. Housing at the periphery grew 50%. We've talked about that, unsustainable, expensive, infrastructure, detrimental in longer term. Housing in the inner ring grew 13%, consolidated urban blocks, increased diversity housing and non-profit typologies, re-evaluate heritage restraints. Housing in the central city grew 100%. Doubled to 103 dwellings, so continue brownfield, reuse old to increase walkable city density. The AUP. The increased supply of housing caused by upzoning is a success story being quoted in Australia. Studies are still being number crunched and graphs drawn, the square metres consented, etc. But I think we can agree increasing the high density zoning has successfully increased supply and moderated costs. Rents increased 85% over the rest of the country, while at the same time only 65% in Auckland. There's an exceptional client debrief from the person who built, this is one of the first Thabs off the rank. We wrote a review of it. There's a copy here if you want to have a look afterwards. This is what the owners said. They wished they knew how conservative the council would be. They had a fully compliant scheme that they were then sent to planning, which cost them $800,000 to resolve. The old earthworks consent was the trigger. The biggest success was utility saving costs for their tenants. These are her feedback comments. Biggest failure, using Trade Me to find tenants, and do it differently next time. Even better, shared community space, join the roof hub with the garden. Recently in Aussie, they had a Design Speaks conference, and this planner from Adelaide presented this idea, and it's got a fancy name, Bluefield Housing, but what it does is take the skills you've already got in your city, and it simply thinks about them a little bit differently. So they take larger sites and they try and, we're always talking about the middle ring between those two lines, the missing middle, but this is looking at basically the level that New Zealand could start with. And it's pretty straightforward. You simply, most houses have done an alteration where they put a kitchen or a bathroom in, and you give permission or you release the setback. So use the setback zone to put that in. So you don't change the structure of the house. So that's the first little relaxation. And then you start adding other houses on, but you don't just think one in the backyard that's 60 square metres. You think, oh, well, I could make a little grouping here. And it's architecturally, this is really simple, but they presented a compelling case, and they've got council to adopt all of these rules. And this would be a more sophisticated version of you can build a 60 square metre thing in your backyard without consent, as long as it meets the building code. We did do a little drawing for a 60 metre thing, a simple one, Alan, which we can talk about later. We're not sure about that pattern book that New South Wales is running. I think they're just trying to remind everyone that most of our housing in Mount Vic was pattern book housing, and that there's still benefit in that idea if you can get away from the bespoke and use the, use more regular, repetitive things. You can get developers, this is a KTA project, private developments in private development are National's chosen housing provider. This is a run-of-the-mill young developer, first major project in trendy Brunswick and Melbourne. The architect's role focused on the public realm benefit and high quality private amenity. So KTA opened it up from the street to the park, became a major park, so they gave a young developer gave part of his land to the city. Of apartment sizes, and there's a mutual benefit between the public and private realms. There's a mix of houses of townhouses there, so they had both sides. And once again, you've got a thick edge that you can inhabit to engage with the circulation. So the next incentive is to incentivise local councils. Now, the Australian federal government wants to build 1.2 million houses by 2029. It has started a long-term future super fund to invest in these. It's all providing government incentive payments to councils to encourage better planning and property administration policies. Currently, they allocate 15,000 per dwelling, capped at $3 billion over 5 years. Not nearly enough. Simon Kustenmacher is an institution. What is the neighbourhood character? The history of the suburb, the private public street interface, landscape, front fences, continual planning, code reviews. Neighbourhood character is proposed to be eliminated in Victoria. It's too subjective and the cause of much NIMBYism and should be replaced by things that can be measured. Andrew Maynard in full flight here. This is what architects who work at the coalface daily need to do more of. Here's Maynard arguing persuasively against mandatory setbacks. The one that the council adopts and which he had to comply with is the Pooh one, and you'll always remember it. And urbanly, streets need walls to contain the public realm. Let's bespoke building without expensive waterproofing, over-articulation. He had a whole lot of reasons about how that was driving up a lot of costs, causing more defects, it's more sustainable without them, you can build better and faster. There's a chat at the AIA conference, Dana Cuff. She works at the UCA Architecture and Spatial Justice. She's concerned about the same things. This is her list. Councils can commission this sort of research and they can use it to drive their decision making. She's a California academic at City Lab. So the green are the research areas and the orange are areas. She goes a bit further than just researching. She lobbies and gets legislation through their state, and she can make change. So one of them that they managed to do was draft legislation to identify unused land on school sites citywide and include housing in future master plan developments. So it's an idea that could be pursued here. Identify publicly owned land that could be leased to private development or low profit housing associations. It's a way of promoting supply. We know polytechnics have a lot of unused land, and now that they need a 30-year development plan, mixed use like this is something that we could talk about more. Councils should review and continuously update their land holding data. Could be part of the digital twin planning resource. Provide better and faster public transport to extend the 1 hour commute zone. Continued expansion of cities is unsustainable, as we've talked about. The essence of the problem of affordability is that land further than 50 kilometres from the city is only cheaper before the high cost of infrastructure and the social cost of suburban isolation without nearby jobs is taken into account. Significantly increasing density within 10 to 30k of the CBD is less difficult in the long term. As economist Samuel Equab cautions, solutions that work well in Holland and Europe may not transfer to New Zealand. Geography and population density make transport and other infrastructure considerations quite difficult. Emphasise the importance of long-term planning rather than endlessly expanding one big city. Establish regional growth centres that already have reasonable urban amenities. Invest in their local bodies. Increase the connection to the national public transport network. For instance, Tauranga, Whakatane, Tauranga, Whanganui, Masterton. These are good places to live if they've got strong public transport connections. This is a building that we were involved with, stage master plan development. This was the last stage, rented to Kaingaora. It's a sort of regional development that we should be encouraged. It's a new regional housing addition to Whanganui, 48,000 population in Whanganui. It's exactly the sort of sensible walk-up medium density housing needed everywhere in Aotearoa. There's 8 new apartments on the street, complete the redevelopment of a former motel block and the additional construction of new units to the rear. In total, the combined property now comprises 14 one-bedroom units, 18 two-bedroom units and 2 three-bedroom units. Developments like this emphasise the importance of long-term planning and establishing regional growth centres with good urban amenities. The new community housing development is a partnership with Soho Developments, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and Compass Housing Services. The tenancy and property management services are provided by Compass Housing Services, not-for-profit registered community housing provider. Accredited by the Community Housing Regulatory Authority, it will provide funding for the project over the 25-year contract period. The Minister of Social Development, MSD, manages the Social Housing Register, which determines who is eligible to rent properties in the development. MSD also provides a rent subsidy to low-income households based on their income. So there's a lot of moving parts to provide a mixed tenancy. Very simple planning, 8 large rentable tenancies, 50 square metres, 2-bed, 83 metre squared apartments, walk up, the lower levels are fully wheelchair accessible and LifeMark compliant. Workspace on the 300 square metre ground floor will supplement the commercial return and help animate Victoria Ave. One end pops out to a pergola courtyard, which could be a caf. Pretty stripped down. Architects shouldn't fuss over that. We get caught up in too much bespoke. It's a hard-ass landscape because of wheelchair access from the car park, and the regions are pragmatic. Why don't we concrete the whole thing? Okay. Expanding the diversity of housing types. We started thinking about this in the 60s. There's an early Wellington one from the idealistic 60s, to buy an apartment or a house, a Danish term, andelsbolig. My Danish isn't so good. In a cooperative means that you pay for the right to use a specific apartment or house. So Gateway's PhD at University College London, which is Denmark. The andelsbolig system has its roots in the wider Danish cooperative, which began in farming and consumer goods in the 19th century. In the post-war decades, housing cooperatives flourished with this. In the 1970s, a legal reform was introduced that granted tenants in the private rental sector the right of first choice to collectively buy. In 2000, thousands of andelsboligas had been established in this way across the country, including the one we live in. For many years, these apartments offered an affordable means of housing that provided security, autonomy and community for hundreds of thousands of people. But since the early 2000s, broader changes in the housing market and in finance have put pressure on the system. Cooperatives like ours, which has mostly maintained the financial and social structures it was founded on, are increasingly hard to come by. Marketing reforms are causing stress. People are trying to buy them. The rapid transformation of the Andenburg system over the last 20 years suggests that alternative forms of housing in other cities would also struggle to survive as long as there are powerful financial interests that can extract ever-growing rents from tenancies and price increases in the private housing sector. In other words, the experience in Copenhagen supports the economist Josh Collins' contention that Western Europe's housing crisis, while housing remains primarily a financial asset instead of a source of shelter. The principles in which the first Andelsbauer were founded and the sense of freedom that they provide are nonetheless worth fighting for. Not so long ago, I had lived in 10 different houses within the space of 5 years, sometimes moving for work or study, but mostly because the landlord had decided to up the rent to an unaffordable amount or sell the apartment. Back then, my home was not something I had any control over. So there's the emphasis on security of tenure. If you look at this is a very good book, Burkhauser, History of Collective Living. It's very clear what's private, what's white, what's collective shared, it's light orange, and what is public. In our apartment at Gateways, there's only collective shared, there's no public interface. And you'll notice that some of the co-op housing in Vienna, that they have public parts that they rent out. They have a nightclub, they have a swimming pool, and a gym. They have other amenities that they earn money from and share with the community and overlap more with the community. Okay, so I'm sorry there's so much text in this, but there's no other way. I'm trying to make economics a bit more interesting. This is Andy Fergus's diagram. It started off being simple, from profit to non-profit, and then he went off and researched all the parts in the middle that have developed in Europe that are more low profit. There's a broad spectrum of diverse housing types with different finance and rely on social impact or low profit investment and market by waiting lists to cap profits, lower costs and reduce risks. The significance of Melbourne is its emergence despite a total lack of active government support through either policy or financial assistance. The Assembly model bridges the gap between renting and home ownership by allowing residents to lease their homes while they save to buy. The rent and purchase price are both fixed, giving them stability while they save. With Assembly acting as the building manager for 5 years, economies of scale spaces. In the Nightingale model, a mixture of architects and impact investors put up supporting the projects and obtaining construction finance. The model is able to aggregate demand and engage. If you've got 10 people and one person is going to pull out, one will come on and replace them, so they're confident that. Where was I saying? Extensive waiting list and teams. All projects are required to demonstrate innovation and environmental design. The model scales up from the first case study in Nightingale 1 to a further 12 projects at various stages of development. The model is evolving with a reduced profit on cost model and a fully buyer-funded model akin to bankrupt on the other. The next form of housing is bankrupt. It means building group. The residents are the collective financiers of their own apartment building. Projects are either citizen-led, in which case they appoint an architect together and develop their design, or architect-led, where a base design is developed and residents are then brought on board to fund the project. The projects are financed through individual mortgages but require a high deposit, often 30%, which can exclude lower income households. The most adventurous buildings have resulted from this close working relationship between residents and architects. Bauer Group projects consistently win architectural awards and achieve the highest standards of sustainability. A result both of residents coming together to make long-term decisions about how they live and financial incentives for green buildings. Typically, Bauer Group are often described as terminating cooperatives in the sense that the cooperative's activity finishes with the completion of the bonds formed in the project development tend to endure. The next type, number 3, housing where individual designs and procure their own compact vertical townhouses within a master plan of other Zelfleurs, creating dynamic new neighbourhoods. Many Dutch city councils have designed precincts with urban renewal master plans, allocating affordable plots through a ballot with a series of strict rules around the design of the envelope, external materials, environmental performance, and even the mix of uses. Each owner engages their own architect and the housing stock, and to be raised to about 33% in the coming years. They use a long-term Grass's 1967 article, "Every child should have 100 parents." Goodman Hire founded a series of pioneering projects on the outskirts between a number of the above models and distinguished by the ongoing participation in the building community long after construction is finished. And if you click on which ones provide security of tenure, you can see that, of course, public housing does because you own it, but all of these co-op models provide security of tenure. If you own property or have a lease for life, it seems that security of tenure should be one of the worthy goals of any civilised society. Security of tenure is egalitarian and helps balance equity. It satisfies at least the first two layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Long leases or lease for life, as Vienna, provide security of tenure for renters. Rent caps give renters a bit more security, though sometimes they produce counterintuitive results. In July, the Dutch government expanded nationwide rent controls that already covered about 80% of rental units to almost all remaining rental properties. Fully 96% of Dutch rental housing is now subject to rent caps. A report from Bloomberg last week details the results. Owners of rental properties are selling their buildings and getting out of the rental housing market. The tenants of those units are being forced to try and find one of the few remaining market rate units or purchase a home in the Netherlands' hot housing market. In either case, home hunters face spiking prices and limited availability. Boosters of rent control will argue that while the policy limits housing supply, it increases stability for tenants. Protected from sudden unaffordable rent increases, renters are able to stay in their homes for longer. Different rent control designs just produce different problems. Apply rent control to new construction and developers build less rental housing. Apply rent control to existing rental housing and developers sell out to owner-occupiers. Prevent landlords from taking their units off the market and housing quality deteriorates. In the long run, this also reduces supply by preventing the redevelopment of existing rental housing. Nearly 70% of the Dutch population live in owner-occupied homes and 29% of the population rent. Netherlands goes against the UE trend where home ownership rates are particularly low in the larger countries. The above rent increases seem not out of hand to me, but we don't know the full picture of what landlords can claim back, compliance costs, the differences between rental rates and mortgage interest rates, negative equity after COVID, etc. So the difference between Holland and Vienna is that in Holland it's only 30% rental, and in Vienna it's 70% rental, and that's probably enough to have enough supply on the market. The limited proffering housing sector in Austria shows how the public funding of housing can positively affect larger economic outcomes. Self-organised public associations provide shelter for 14 to 25% of households. The at-cost associated rents have a dampening effect on for-profit rents. Economic modelling shows that for every 10% share of cost-based housing added to the rental market, for-profit rents fall by about 5% on average. When housing providers do not maximise profits but only recover their costs, the associated tenants have more dollars left at the end of the month. Their purchasing power rises, the average gain per household amounts to almost €2,000, 3,600 per year, Kiwi. Lower rentals also put downward pressure on commercial rents. We notice many bespoke shops selling highly crafted quality products in Vienna. There are two fiscal gains. Spending on housing benefit is reduced while tax revenue from increased consumption of non-housing goods is enhanced. Housing affordability adds in the region of €600 million to €1 billion to Australia's GDP every year, about 0.25%. There was a recent Westpac interview on Catherine Ryan, Radio New Zealand, on the 23rd of July, where Westpac announced a target of at least $1 billion in new lending to affordable housing solutions over the next 3 years. Westpac commissioned Deloitte for a report into home ownership and ways to arrest the decline of the past 3 decades. Its report says shared equity, rent-to-own and leasehold properties could get tens of thousands of lower to middle income households into ownership. But a lack of awareness of the options and capital has been holding these pathways back. The Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust has put some 200 households into leasehold homes with 100-year leases at about half the cost of market rates. Lease rents are reset based on fair fixed rates around 1.5% of the rateable value. Support, how's your resilience holding up? Is it all right? I'm only just starting. No, it's slide 59 of 103. Support could include provide state underwriting and or lease land to reduce land costs for the ethical housing movement, Assembly Communities with its build-to-rent approach, Nightingale Developments, iwi developments on Maori land and collectively owned land. Expand the New Zealand Simplicity Living KiwiSaver model. Super funds can provide loans. Hester build-to-rent ended up buying this Macaulay project I'll show you soon. Legislate a register to subsidise low-profit co-ops as the Vienna model. That's something we've been thinking about pursuing with Chris Pink. When municipality grants public land at 10% market value and loans construction money at low rates, paid back over 30 years, to pre-registered low-profit developer groups who agree to a low, say 3.5% per annum, profit on their capital and own the building for life. And if the co-op opts to comply with the legislated social housing rules concerning operation, reselling, etc. Co-housing participants develop the brief together and make a deposit to buy the landlord, get planning permission for the right to rent for life. There's no typical model. Every co-house or building group project delivers in its financing. Social makeup, the wishes and desires of the group and the project's resulting architectural and urban qualities. Often the largest challenge for groups is to organise the loan quickly enough to secure the site. To make this beneficial co-op housing more attractive, governments could legislate to allow payment on a site to be deferred until the groups are fully formed and planning permission granted. To damp increasing price rises, New Zealand could stimulate the formation of low-pressure housing associations by exactly the same rules, by legislating similar. If you registered as a charity, a tax dispensation, profits go back into the company, pool of low interest long-term public loans that can be applied for if you're a registered LPA. This would be a more effective use of public grants over the long term as they are repaid. Security of tenure with a larger tenant mix with different income is more reflective of society. Over the long term, it generates more equity than propping up the profitability of multi-property owning landlords. Miss Sargfabrik means coffin factory in German. It's another example of cooperative flats that qualify for 50% subsidy from the municipality of Vienna. It's Franz Schumitz. He's a crazy architect who toured on a tour with Kirsten. He's the founder of Architects DDK3, second communal residential complex after his original co-op design for 110 units. He extended the Association for Integrative Living to include these additional 39 residential units. So this was new build, the other one was a refurbished old structure. The 2-year planning process for Ms. Sarbre was geared around tenant participation and grassroots democracy. All initiated discussions and brainstorming sessions with 30 to 50 potential tenants to design an affordable alternative form of housing that contains living and working spaces. Franz believed this time-intensive briefing and compliance researching process should be a separate organisation to the standard architectural stages of design and contractor procurement. He lost a lot of money on that process. Some of the questions, and this was another byproduct of the Nightingale with the 6 architects involved. They all put in a lot more time than they normally put in, and they changed the model afterwards when they realised, and they realised how much work a developer actually does. Some of the questions asked together is what is desired by individuals and what by the communal group. What will the building be as functional in 20 years' time when couples separate? The social element at the core of and a sense of responsibility, and the architecture can facilitate this. For instance, an internal access gallery ensures that residents meet whenever they pass each other. It's pretty narrow. There's also enough space to allow people to use the access gallery as a balcony with tables and chairs outside their doors. Hans also took the chance for a little bit of architectural experimentation by slipping an extra half floor into his section. And we had a look through that space. It was quite interesting. He would never have been able to build that with a developer. Most people were open to new ideas. One of these was sloping the floors approximately a third of the overall apartment plan area of an apartment, which gave a generous 3.2 section height over the living and allowed an additional floor. Surprisingly, the apartments with sloping floors were the first to be rented. An ordinary developer would not have taken such a risk. The other interesting picture there was the nightclub. They buried it in the basement so the kids could go down there, but they also had gigs for the city, and they earned quite a lot of money. It became quite part of the centre. But they designed it to be soundproof. Common facilities include a multifunctional library. You can keep your own book collection, an IT space with teleworking stations, fully equipped kitchen and dining area for dining parties and celebrations, laundry and a club room for teenagers managed by them. Note, they decided not to have an app. Vienna's gone completely analogue, and they make you come down and write your name on a list, so you might meet someone. And the rules were extended from Saar Fabric, the first one, 2 stages of heritage reuse to a new build Saar Fabric. The Association for Integrative Living is the landowner and operator of the residential complex and acts as a landlord. The residents make up the members of the association. There's an internal contract, largely similar to a cooperative, stipulating the rights and obligations of the residents. There are 10 to 12 meetings a year in which general operations are discussed. Important decisions are made via the twice-yearly general meetings of the association by a 66% majority vote. During those general meetings, an association board comprised of 6 volunteers is also selected. The board is supported by a professional management team responsible for the operational implementation of the work program, as well as managing the individual business areas, culture house, bathing house, etc. The association currently employs around 20 people. So they employ 20 people, and they elect 6 people to manage those 20 people. So it's not some of the people on boards, especially in gateways where we are, they spend a lot of time doing a lot of community hours. This is something that we've got a ticking time bomb in New Zealand to provide, and so this is a way to provide downward pressure on housing rents. You use public money. I don't think this has got much chance of flying, but I'll just talk about it. Use public money to renovate private housing stock that then accepts permanent rent control. Introduce some limit of maximum rent increases. This is a long game, utilising the state's ability to lend more cheaply and to preemptively repair, upgrade the time bomb of old decaying damp timber housing. This reciprocal initiative ensures a good supply of future private property rental amenity, and a fully compliant insulated energy upgrade could be undertaken at a large scale, generating many jobs. With the reciprocated rent control to dampen future speculation and maintain supply, landlords can still achieve a moderate capital gain. In Australia, in Act, the rent increases are limited to 110% of inflation, which has led to smaller than average rent increases, though it does link rent increases with inflation rather than wage rises, so it adds to the cost of living pressures. The maximum the landlord would be able to lift the rent once every 2 years, up from the current 12-month limit, and it may face a cap, but as we've talked about, caps need a lot more analysis. In the 1980s, Vienna City, seeking to further expand its pool of rent-controlled housing, began a program to use public money to rehabilitate 10,000 old decaying private houses per year. Landlords have been unwilling to make the upgrades for decades, and eventually the private sector accepted rent controls introduced with the public investment in the building upgrade. By law now, any private housing built before 1945 is subject to rent control. Legislating for public authority interventions and access to finance will slowly introduce longer-term equality into the property market. The burden on the taxpayer will trend to cost neutral over decades, as well as preemptively reduce the social cost of homelessness. The hand-wringing about the social crisis, the claims that it's complicated and that there's no silver bullet, and the broad resignation of not having a solution is all a form of public policy crime. Our government has not committed to build a yearly social housing. However, it is going to flood the market. The changes are the establishment of housing growth targets for Tier 1. The changes made by Bishop are the establishment of housing growth targets for Tier 1, Tier 2 councils. New rules require the cities to be allowed to expand upwards at the urban fringe, strengthening the intensification provisions in the national policy, and new rules requiring councils to enable mixed-use development. Given 2/3 of the population is interested in maintaining the value of their own property and that political tribes fight to reverse each other's good fortune, the solution is to establish a bipartisan open-mindedness. I might be doubling up on this one, sorry about that. Vic Homes Public Social Housing. How do you reuse housing that was avant-garde at the time it was made? Victoria built 40 of these. They built their own factory, they made the precast, and they cleared 40 sums. It's 60 years old now, and what do you do with them? We were part of a group that looked at comparing a new case study, a new build, exactly the same building to compare, a refurbishment of the existing up to Australian Building Code standard, and a refurbishment of the existing up to Vic Home standard, which means it had exterior space and a balcony and a few other civil amenities. So if you price them from embodied carbon, operational carbon and capital cost, and compare each one's in an abstract way, there's 9 figures, that's all we were doing, we weren't talking about design. You can start to see that there's no cost for embodied carbon in the Australian construction market, and if you put a cost that's say equivalent to the UK, and you start adding it up and you put it over the whole 44, it's a 1.5 reduction in capital cost, 1.5 billion reduction in capital cost if you refurbish the existing. It's a 22 million, you can read the numbers there, reduction in operating costs. And you can refit those buildings with the tenants in place floor by floor. So we just wanted to expand the discussion to start talking about that. To look at a couple of other examples that are happening in Australia, happening in social housing right now. Vic Homes is building one new development. This is the public estate precinct plan. This is the layout around open courtyard. This is our KTA, start thinking about the massing. And I think what's most interesting is that it's social housing, but the interior fit out is, there's a Viennese incentive to make worker housing as good as palaces for kings. And so the idea here that this is the same equivalent finishing as any private development is being applied. 2.7 metre high living spaces, 2.4 bedroom, there's no downstands in the ceiling. Little things like that are quite significant. Build to rent. Macaulay Road is a build to rent development by Assembly, who've sold the development to the new ethical super fund Hester. The land is leased from Melbourne Council, brownfield in an old industrial estate on an arterial route within 5 minutes walk from the South Kensington station. Developer builds and operates for 50 years, returning ownership to Melbourne City. Retains commercial ground floor, supermarket, a jigsaw set into the neighbourhood to enhance existing pedestrian networks. During the design process, we replanned special disability accommodation units, providing various levels of care on the north side of the B2 block. To community housing providers, they will rent. It's been caught out with increased cost supply lines after COVID. It's in the continual process of value management by contractor HASA. Interestingly, the Assembly client has to maintain the block for 50 years. It's helped them revisit some of the details and make them make wiser decisions. you can see here, what was the heading here? You can see here roughly the layout, and you can see the numbers of apartments and the set out. KTA working on the roadside ones to give a different hand over the development. The public to private spectrum's always critical, linking to the existing walkways. However, in the paper this week, the building to rent sector is facing a wave of consolidation. Developers of smaller scale are opting out of operating these assets. Some projects pivot to build to sell or student accommodation. The reality with this new class may be hitting home. It might be general property cycle, or it might be build to rent itself. The project starts have slumped by 19% from last year, down from 6,500 to about 5,000 projects. Rising interest rates and construction costs are cited. BTR pipeline planning approval has dropped 12% in the last 6 months. It's harder to raise required debt and equity capital, even with new super fund investing. Uncertainty over the tax regime applied to foreign-owned projects. Government is trying to halve the withholding tax applied to foreign investment down to 15%. They need to resolve that to keep this sector alive. The ground lease model is another similar process where the public land is leased from the government, the developer owns and operates for 50 years, build to rent. In this development of KTA's, is the big block is social housing and the other block is build to rent. The main initiative, and it's a big one, is that you can adjust the master plan so that all apartments get through ventilation, and there's no differentiation between, there's tenure blindness, it's called. There's no differentiation between the poorer and the richer. So just quickly, plans, architects. Very clean, very simple interiors, just getting a good standard on both types of housing. I think one of our last points, or our second to last point, is continual advocacy. Can we become more radical about holding all governments to account? The state should never reduce the public housing estate. Instead, it could find innovative ways to improve the return cash flow from the public funded projects. We should continue to advocate for fairness and equality. We still live in a democracy. Given the 3-year election cycle, we can generate bipartisan consensus instead of manufacturing phony cultural wars. The rise of demonstrably false claims in our public discourse are damaging trust in public institutions and making it even harder to address the policy we endlessly diagnose, but never reach a bipartisan understanding to act on. Focus on facts and keep asking, how will we live tomorrow? YIMBY groups in Australia, I prefer to call it Quimby, Quality in My Backyard, have followed the Abundant Housing Network and made submissions on a range of broad brush ideas that include consulting the wider community at the start of any processes, broad zoning changes across large areas rather than specific sites, moving from prescriptive rules to outcomes-based regulation of land. There's the concept of patient capital and inclusionary zoning, which were discussed in Catherine Ryan's show. Facilitating development in high amenity areas well served by public and active transport and social infrastructure. Investigate mechanisms for the efficient, equitable consolidation of urban blocks, particularly small sections in residential areas. Remove parking space requirements, that old one. There's 3 simple points from the UK. I don't know if you've ever been to look around any of Peter Barber's housing developments. You should. He looked at old models in Glasgow that were the original slum tenements, and he just tried to tweak them slightly because they're obviously very efficient to build, but very poor to live in. And so he's managed to come up with more or less his own typology. He's got fairly hard rules about what needs to happen. So private sector rent controls, we obviously need to do a bit more work of that. Halt the selling of council houses under right to buy. Well, I think I'm concerned that Aotearoa will have to start doing that before the end of this government. And we should always be building council houses a year funded by direct taxation. Everybody thinks that. Keep an eye on the big picture. The Australian federal government wants to build 1.2 million. It now costs 36% more to build an average average apartment in Sydney than it did in 2018. The average cost rising to 905,000. There's no single driver. Everything from slow planning decisions, timeframes gone beyond 100 days, to high salaries of tradespeople make hitting these targets difficult. Builders' wages have increased more than 33% since the pandemic, outpacing 20% increase across the other industries. There's three key reasons why that the New South Wales Productivity Commission give. At least they've still got a Productivity Commission. Ours was disbanded for some reason. We need that research, we need that market research, and we need a current. The big magnificent increases in state infrastructure spending in Victoria and New South Wales, if you just think about New Zealand like one of these states, they increased spending from 30 billion in 2018 to 42 billion. The governments have deeper pockets than private developers and prospective home buyers. When public infrastructure like the Sydney Metro comes on faster than the construction sector can grow, governments bid up the price of labour and materials, making residential developments less feasible. The biggest hurdle is the lack of workers altogether. They need 30,000 more. We'll supply them from New Zealand, it's all right. 30,000 more needed to meet housing targets, and state infrastructure projects will need another 96,000. Changing the migration mix is an option. The review found that tax breaks and subsidies are not effective instruments for increasing supply, largely because tax breaks have a greater influence on demand and tend to result in higher prices for land and extending homes rather than increase new housing supply. Subsidising developers to build infrastructure doesn't work. When the developers are given concessions on their contributions to infrastructure, they bid for scarce land and drive that up. Waiving infrastructure contributions results in windfall gains for landowners, not more or cheaper housing. It's very sophisticated analysis to make all these linkages between things, and you cannot make simplistic binary comparisons. So just to finish up, how's Bish doing so far? So if you look at our list and remove taxes to sort, well, he got a cross and a white ant. White ant's the worst. He did the opposite. Balance immigration with housing demands. They started to think about that a little bit more. Expand inward. You know, of those 6 points that he's put out, he gets a tick for 3, 4, and 2. Number 3 is, I think I wrote them here, if you could be, strengthening intensification processes of the National Policy Statement, urban development, 6-storey or greater. So he's let councils decide. Decide about that. Number 4, he's let yeah, I can't find number 4 just right here. But new rules requiring councils to enable mixed use. Well, that's that's old hand. Number 5, the abolition of minimum floor areas and balcony requirements. That'll be detrimental, so that gets across. That'll be detrimental to legacy. That might make it cheaper, but there should be a minimum standard. The best standard in Australia is actually Sydney's one. Melbourne's isn't as good, or West Australia. I don't think we've got a standard in New Zealand for apartment living. Not a universal one. Am I right about that? No, there is a universal one for New Zealand, or just for Wellington. Anyway, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. We've got one. There's lots of examples. We don't need to make our own one. Expand the diversity of housing types. I think there's a little tick there. It was quite interesting when Chris Pink was talking to Steve Bronius. He quoted, "If we allow those entities that are not government to work together and to be encouraged with some good government funding, I felt that was a better way of realising my ideas of collectivism." I hope he can recover from his attempt to join the Cabinet Boys Club by dumbing down the New Zealand Installation Code. And remember that he said that, because that's exactly what co-op housing does. And at the moment in Vienna, 58 limited profit housing associations administer approximately 200,000 rental and cooperative flats in the city, population the size of Auckland soon, 1.9 mil. Every year, roughly 5,000 units are built by non- or limited profit housing operatives. The government has to put out very little money to keep that machine rolling. Economist Mariana Mazzucato refers to the seed money as public venture capital. It's a book, Mission Capitalism champions the private sector can work well with a sophisticated public sector that knows how to work with them. If Pink's government does what he says and provides public venture capital to commercially develop collective housing, offering tenure for life, then by 2033, co-op associations could constitute 10% of Aotearoa's housing stock. I was in Auckland over the weekend, and I did think Kāinga was getting the mix about right. This is an Ockham development combined with Kāinga, building 5 buildings exactly the same, designed by architects, 1.5 bed studios, a lot of repetition, a lot of cost saving, public money combining with the private money of Ockham. Ockham built, 3 or 4 1- and 2-bedroom public housing apartments along with ground floor commercial. 7 Homestar, one of the apartment buildings constructed in mass timber. KO had the mix about right. 5,000 houses they've built, and in all was building a significant public portfolio. This is the right scale to deal with housing. And just to finish, I thought I'd return to the start. Housing is a public good. Kāinga should continue to contribute to our society, much like the millionaire businesswoman Ranji Patel, who started a chain of GP clinics with her husband, Kantilal. The couple founded Tamaki Health, starting with a single clinic in Otawa in 1977, building it into the largest independent primary healthcare provider in the country and generating significant wealth as KO was starting to. Rajani says, after school our job was to be in our Herne Bay fruit shop, and we learnt very quickly you had to be very customer focused, because in those days people didn't just touch anything in the shop, you put it in a bag for them. If someone wanted a pound of peaches, you gave them good quality ones, because if they were bruised they'll be bringing them back or they won't come back. It's there she learnt the value of money as well as the importance of not judging her customers. With shops closing at midday on Saturdays back then, boxes of produce about to go off would be made up for cheap. At 11:30 there would be 10 families that would come. That's how we learned about money. We never discussed money. We were always talking about the customer and how you did good service. And those people that came at 11:30 a.m, we never judged them. We knew they could not afford it or they had large families. So don't judge people in their circumstances. Health is the same. The Patel's first clinic in Otawa served a lot of low-income families, forcing them to do things differently. The mainstream would say they don't care about their health because they don't turn up to appointments. They don't realise they have no phone, only one car, the husband's gone to work, and mum's got 3 children, and there's no way she can keep an appointment if it starts raining. We had to be patient-focused. Back then, most GP clinics were open from 9 a.m. till 3 p.m. We opened them from 8 o'clock to 6 p.m, which suited the people in our community, so they came to us. They hired locums to cope with the extra patients, which again wasn't a done thing unless a doctor was going on holiday. But my husband said, we're not turning away anyone, and so our obstacle became our opportunity. Practice grew and they acquired more, eventually building it into a chain of nearly 50 clinics. The focus of customer service never changed. We realised our families were very transient during the school holidays, so we installed computers in 1984. The cost of a house, $40,000 back then. Do you remember that? $40,000. And we had to install air conditioning for the dot matrix printer. She laughs. But that database was so important as our patients could go to any of the clinics and be seen. Access was our main priority. Providing access to a community that needs it is our strength. 3 or 4 generations would come to us. The loyalty was incredible. The Eastern way is the more you give, the more you get, the more will come back to you. And I think that's worked for us. Dame Anne Salmon recently argued in reaction to current populist cultural warrior binaries that Aotearoa has a rich vein of relational thinking evident in Te Reo and in the treaty, and if it's neither individualistic nor collective, but a kin-based combination of both based on maniakitanga. Giving mana to others will encourage mutual respect and reciprocal exchanges. Mana is the same concept, and most of the obstacle to doing housing properly is our own attitude. Learning to value collective and our collective partners much more will result in a much richer new world society. So thank you for your perseverance. There's probably copies of that talk. There's a little bit of stuff I didn't cover, believe it or not. And there's a few copies of things in there if you like, hard copy. But thanks for your perseverance, A, in coming out tonight, and B, and not even moving an inch. Am I way over time?
Oh, only, yes. But that's
I was
fine.
too scared to run it to see how long it took.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I mean, what impressed me about that whole presentation was
Yeah.
the depth and breadth of knowledge, and all of those 10 points held a lot of heft. I mean, they could have each been talks. So
Yeah.
yeah, you've done well on the grand scheme of things. But we have run out of time.
And using up people's patience, so thank you. Yeah.
But we have run out of time for questions.
Yeah.
But we haven't run out of time to have a good feed and
Yeah.
a drink,
Yeah.
and to
Yeah, we can have a yarn
talk
then.
to Chris
Yeah.
over there.
Good.
So thank you very much.
Okay. What is the time? I'm half an hour.
Half an hour. Oh no.
I should have cut it more. Yeah.